Welcome to Rico 12. I'm Justin, your host and a grateful child of an all-powerful, all-loving God. Rico 12 is all about exploring the common threads of addiction and sharing tools and hope from those on a similar path. We gather from diverse backgrounds, faiths, and places to learn and support one another. Our speakers represent various fellowships, addictions, and afflictions. We reflect on the richness of our shared experiences in these meetings. Join us in this journey of recovery and unity. Today's speaker for the 206th meeting is Melissa M., a first-timer at Rico 12, and whose topic today is healing from betrayal trauma. And we're excited to get into this, and I'm really grateful for her willingness to come and talk, and we'll get to her talk and the Q&A afterwards in just a minute. First, for a little bit of business. The Rico 12 family of recovery resources is expanding with more support for both addicts and their loved ones. Explore additional Rico 12 podcasts by checking in the chat of our live meetings and the podcast show notes. I'll have those links in here in just a minute. We're also exploring the possibility of creating new resources in multiple languages worldwide. If you are in long-term recovery and speak a language other than English as a native language, and you have a recovery network of people that would be willing to also do something for what we're doing here, that would be really cool. Reach out to me, send an email to rico12pod@gmail.com, and we'll start discussing those possibilities. Rico 12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your contributions to help us continue in our mission. A special thanks this week goes out to Jean for becoming a monthly spearhead, and also to Geraldine for her donation. If you'd like to support Rico 12 and become a spearhead, visit rico12.com/support. Or check our links here in the live meeting in the show notes of the podcast. Your support really does make a difference in sharing our message of recovery. We look forward each meeting to receiving from the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now I'll introduce today's speaker, Melissa M. Here's a little bit about her. Melissa is a mother of 5, a spouse to a sex and food addict, and is a recovering codependent. She found herself in the rooms of recovery with her husband starting in 2009, but only found herself in the rooms for her own personal healing and recovery in 2021, and has benefited greatly in her healing journey. Melissa is a talented carpenter and a home editor who enjoys blessing others with home organization and experiencing the power it holds in helping others, specifically in recovery, by bringing joy and clarity to space, mind, and spirituality as it has in hers. She's found that a home in order opens a pathway that aids in triumphant results in recovery across the board. Her story of finding healing from betrayal trauma and codependency is what she will be sharing with us all today. Take it away, Melissa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. So, so as it said in my bio, I am married to a sex and food addict. Sex addiction was his first addiction, and food addiction was a transition addiction that happened a few years later. So just a little bit about our history is I knew about my husband's sex addiction when we were close to engagement. And it did take a lot of processing on my part. I was a very sheltered person. I didn't know much about pornography, masturbation, or sex addiction. And so it took many hours, many days of my husband's brutal honesty, which I was more than grateful to have. And together, yes, we decided to get married, and I do not regret that decision. However, in our first year of marriage, we got pregnant pretty quickly, and with that came a lot of stress. And within the first year of our marriage, betrayal did happen. My husband did relapse, and it was devastation on all of our parts, but more so because I was pregnant. And that joy, that opportunity to look forward to a new baby was squandered. And so it was very hard. It was very hard for me to process betrayal without even knowing what betrayal trauma was at the time. I had no education. And so the first few years of our marriage were very, very dark. And um, unfortunately, my codependency was born. And I just controlled, and I did what I could to stay safe and to control my husband, and with the ultimate goal of not getting betrayed again. Um, so fast forward, and we found ourselves in the rooms, 12 step, and I was under the impression, the assumption, that we were there to fix my husband so that he wouldn't hurt me again. And I didn't realize how typical this was. But that was how I did 12 step for many, many years. About 13 years is how I went into the rooms. And it wasn't just 12 step. We had so many programs and retreats and opportunities, and spent thousands of dollars looking for his healing. And it was maddening because throughout it he was relapsing, white knuckling, relapsing, white knuckling, relapsing. And the whole time my codependency was becoming stronger and stronger. Again, with no education, no terminology. My betrayal trauma was worsening. I had no idea. I just thought I was becoming a lunatic. I thought I was becoming the wife that I never wanted to become, angry and hurt and desperate. And yeah, just that betrayal trauma really did take over, as well as that codependency. So it got to a point about 2.5 years ago, where I started noticing that his cycles, with now the transition addiction of food addiction getting thrown into the mix, the cycle of white knuckling from pornography and masturbation would then activate his food addiction for the coping. And then when he was working on his food addiction, his masturbation pornography would cycle back in. And so it just became this black hole of cycles. And I couldn't see straight, and I couldn't breathe. And I was still having, our children. We have 5. We have 4 boys and a darling little girl. And unfortunately, every pregnancy he did act out. He did relapse. And so all of my pregnancies, I just couldn't find joy. I never found joy in my pregnancies, and it did translate into my mothering. Anyway, so I did need healing there. But it was about 2.5 years ago, after my daughter nearly died from birth. I have a blood disorder that I wasn't aware of, and it nearly took her in utero. And that woke me up of, I can't waste my life. I can't have a daughter that my higher power has saved, only to bring into a circumstance where her mother is not mentally well. And she is comparing herself to everybody. And her self-worth is in her image, and is desperate for attention for her spouse. And I can't teach that to my daughter. She's too precious to pass that along. And yet my husband's cycling was becoming more and more desperate. And I started noticing that the time between cycles was shortening. And it was becoming more of a daily problem instead of a weekly problem, a monthly problem, or a yearly problem. It was becoming a daily problem. And his problem was becoming a circumstance where I found myself with suicidal thoughts. And it got to the point where I had to call the suicide prevention line 3 times. I'm going to pause and tell you that if anybody ever finds themselves in that position, calling that prevention line is the absolute best you could possibly do. They are incredible angels sent earthside. They're incredible. I owe them my life. They walked me off a wall, and they really listen, and they validate, and they give you the right resources. So after the reality of bringing a daughter into this world and needing to teach her differently, as well as calling the suicide prevention line, and that reality, I realized that something needed to change. And my higher power was prompting me to really research what boundaries are, what codependency is, and what betrayal trauma is. And with all of that education came a lot of power. And so I started getting that education that I needed desperately, and the boundaries scared me. That became a whole new fear unlocked, although it was a power that I knew I needed and I was lacking. But that boundary talk was incredibly needed in my life. I had no boundaries. I was a codependent. I let my husband's addiction wipe me clean. I was angry and just a very toxic situation. So it became very apparent after the third time I called suicide prevention line that my higher power was ready to truly direct me in the right direction. And circumstances happened where desperation spoke louder than faith. And I'm grateful for that. But I turned to my higher power and I said, I don't even know what a healthy boundary looks like. And I was instructed through a lot of pondering and prayer that a healthy boundary would look like having his addictions not acted out in my home. And in my home needs to be a sacred spirit, and it needs to be protection for me and my children, both emotionally, spiritually, and then of course just that mental safety. So I, with a lot of fear but a lot of faith, laid down with my husband that boundary, saying that I am not asking you to stop acting out. That is your agency. What I'm asking you to do is to please not act out in my home. This is my safety net, and it cannot be compromised any longer. And we both agreed with that being a healthy boundary. And I also had the typical understanding of, great, the boundary is set, nothing will have to happen. The boundary is the cure. But that wasn't the case. Just a couple of weeks later, the boundary was crossed. And this was the first time my husband had ever lied to me. He was always honest. For the most part, there was a couple of interesting moments in our marriage where lies were present. But this is the first time in our marriage where he was lying for an extended period of time. And that was part of my fear, setting the boundary that would cause lying, because he wouldn't want to have me enforce that boundary. And so once the lies were detected, unfortunately on my part, he wasn't forthright. I came to an impasse where I needed to enforce that boundary. And I knew very well what that would entail. Knowing my addict, I knew that the moment that I would enforce that boundary, worst case scenario would happen. And I sat on that for a couple of days with my higher power, scared to death, didn't think I was strong enough. But my higher power gave me the courage, and my boundary was enforced. And that was the first time that my husband and I separated. And yes, unfortunately, worst case scenario did happen during that separation. Extreme betrayal then happened. Choices that he had not made previous in our marriage did happen. Certain affairs did take place. But nothing of that enforcement did I ever regret. Because the moment I actually fell through or followed through with my boundary was the day non-codependency in my soul was born. I no longer had that codependent tendency of, no, it's fine, you're good, just stay home, don't worry, we've got this. Like, it was finally an opportunity to say, this is my worth, and you've crossed that boundary, and I need you to leave. And it was so empowering. It was hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but my higher power definitely let me know how empowering non-codependency is. And so that was the day my non-codependent soul was born. And I have been learning how to upkeep that power. I'm not perfect. I'm still learning, but that was the first time. Anyway, the agreement to come back home from the separation was that he had to be within the rooms again, and has a sobriety date and a sponsor, and you know, all of these certain aspects that we laid down with the boundary. And he had accomplished those and was welcomed back into the home. And unfortunately, it was only a few weeks later that the boundary was crossed again. And I didn't know that I had to withhold that. I had to upkeep that boundary, but I was learning as I go. And yet again, the boundary was crossed. And so the boundary was enforced. And this time it was harder, knowing the trauma that I was walking into. And more affairs did happen as I did ask him to leave. Unfortunately, with his decisions, the last separation, my higher power did have to sit me down and say, this is the point of hardship where I am telling you that divorce is acceptable. And it's okay. It's okay to divorce him now. Sorry. There was a peace given to me knowing that if I chose to divorce my husband, there would be a plan B for me, and it would be a very happy one. And I knew that there was a man prepared for me in this life that would ultimately not betray me, and we would have a happy life, not a perfect one, but a happy one. And in that conversation with my higher power, I was also given an opportunity to stay. And when I was given that opportunity by my higher power, who I call Heavenly Father, I was told, but if you stayed, please know that it will be an uphill battle, but one that would not only bless your family, your husband, and you, but it would also bless generations. And it was just such a beautifully awful moment. It was beautiful because I knew, oh my gosh, what in the world does that entail? I mean, blessing generations, blessing my husband, blessing myself. That sounds all amazing, but an uphill battle, that's not a promise of peace. That is an uphill battle with a full understanding that relapses will be, and more betrayal trauma, and heaven only knows what. And that plan B was filled with peace. It was filled with joy. But ultimately, conversating with my higher power, I realized that this life isn't meant to be easy, and it is meant to be filled with joy. And that second option that he gave me, the uphill battle, blessing generations, was just that. It wasn't easy, but it was going to be filled with joy. And so I took a blind step of faith, and I chose to stay. And it was the hardest choice I have ever made in my marriage up to this point. Because at that point, I was not aware of how devastatingly dark and low my husband's sex addiction had gone during that separation. And so I had a discovery day headed my way that definitely fell under the category of uphill battle, for sure. But excuse me. But this is where my organization comes in. So what I wasn't expecting during that choice to stay was incredible lessons, incredible opportunities to see my higher power's hand, his power in my life, to bring both healing from codependency and betrayal, but also joy and blessings and lessons and knowledge to not only help what I was promised, my husband, my kids, myself, but many, many friends and many of their kids and husbands. And it is such a joy to see that my hardship is helping others. And I'm not even fully healed yet. So when I had stayed, there was an opportunity for me from my higher power to, and I quote, get your home in order. And it didn't make sense at the time because I didn't feel responsible for getting my house out of order. I felt like that instruction probably deserved to go to my husband, considering he was creating chaos in the home. And yet the prompting was given to me. Get your house in order. So I pondered on that and I realized that I needed to start somewhere. So I started with getting my house clean, which I'm a tiny person, but it was deeper than that. It was pull out everything from the closet, organize it, label it, throw things away. The typical home editor, I watched the home edit on Netflix religiously and I learned of their ways anyway, and I would get my house in order. And there were times my husband's addiction went darker and he was very angry. And part of the boundary of not being a codependent came with making choices that I knew the addict would fight me on. And this is where I was learning again how not to be codependent on what his addiction needed and what I in my healing journey needed. And so there were many times that uphill battle became straight uphill, and he would fight me and mock me for cleaning the house. He would mock me for trying to clean up our show watching and what spirit we were bringing into the home, what influences. And so with that, I continued with knowing that I have been told to get my house in order. So in order, I will get it. And so I was cleaning up our spirituality. I was cleaning up our finances. I was cleaning up our house. And the whole time my husband was fighting me, and in vicious ways. There were parts of his addiction that would purposely act out, purposely relapse as a their ha to me for trying to get the house in order, especially when it came to the spiritual order. He would purposely betray me on those fronts. So it became very hard to continue, but I would learn non-codependency along the way. But there were points where I was just devastated. I was broken. I was going to my higher power saying, what is the point? There's no point in this. He's getting worse. I'm not seeing the point in this. Many times, actually, there was that conversation of what is the point? Until randomly one day, it was, unfortunately, after my husband in our religion, I'm LDS, certain behaviors are inappropriate. And he found himself in a disciplinary council of our church to see if he was going to be excommunicated for his actions. And trying to support him through that as the spouse who's been betrayed was incredibly hard. An experience that I love having in my books to help others, but hard. And it was after that council when the point of it came very clear to my mind as to why I was getting my house in order. My husband had come home and from this meeting, And I had been organizing for months. And he comes home, and there was just this switch. There was just this light in him. He came home and he was just like, oh, this home is beautiful. You've done a very amazing job. I can open up cabinets and have nothing fall on me. And I can go look for a razor and I can find it because it's labeled under the razor section. And I can just pick out a pair of underwear and not feel like I have to dig forever. And it's just, there is such a light in this house. And I am so sorry for trying to snuff that light out for many months. I need the spirit of this home. You were doing it for me. And from that point on, with many other resources that started helping him, he started improving little by little. And my kids started improving little by little. And I started improving loads by loads because I had a point to it. So there was just this passion of organization. And after I got my house organized, you can only organize so much. I started seeing the benefit of blessing others with organization. And Heavenly Father, my higher power, was sending me to those who I didn't realize were betrayed spouses, but he would lead me to go organize their homes. And after I organized their homes, they would have a similar reaction of, I can breathe again. It feels like I can just reach to my higher power so much more clearly. This is a power. This is a gift. And so that's where I am. I organize homes. I keep my house as organized as I can with 4 boys, tornadoes, and a little girl. It's work every day, but every time that I feel spiritually clogged or codependent again, I realize that if I just go make my bed, if I just go clean my house, I realize that for me, they are connected, that my mind fog is 100% connected to what the status of my house is. If my house is clean and organized and not in a way that nobody can live, it is literally, okay, we've cleaned it. Now you can go play with toys. You can, live, but with the understanding, a boundary that we need it back into organization. So once I get my house organized, I find that my mind is more organized and ready to attack codependency, ready to hold boundaries, and ready to turn to my higher power. So that is what I have prepared today. It is such a power. I encourage many to look into starting small with organization and see it in what category you need it most: spiritually, financially, physically, mentally, and then go for it. Meditation is a huge one for the mental organization. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for sharing your experience, your strength, your hope, the trials and the victories there that are happening in your life. I appreciate the miracles that are going on there. And I love whether you meant to or not, you referenced the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous really, really well. One of the stories in the chapter Working for Others, one of the relations there ends with this paragraph: burn into the consciousness of every man that he can get well regardless of anyone. The only condition is that he trust in God and clean house. And I see that happening in your life, at least right now, regardless of whatever is going on around you, trusting in God, cleaning house, whether that's a literal cleaning of house or a figurative cleaning of house. Thank you for sharing those things. A reminder to our live audience: if you have questions for Melissa, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. Looks like 2 speech bubbles over the top of each other. We'll get to those. I've written a few questions here, and we will ask some questions of you here, Melissa. I'm excited to get into this.
Great.
One of these questions I want to get into here, and I've written several, but the one that I want to start out with is, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes a little bit. Hey, I'm trying to do these things and I'm being fought from every angle. How do you avoid and stay out of going into a victim thinking mode when that happens? How do you keep I don't know if positive mindset is the right thing, but just out of victim mode?
Oh man, that is one of my passions. I am going to be very honest. I only realized how to do that maybe 6 months ago. So for the last 2 years, that was when I got the instruction of get your house in order and to stay with my husband. And the whole time I was relishing in victim mode. I'll be honest with you. That is something that again came with lack of education. So I handled it well where I could. Higher power, Heavenly Father brought me through how to heal even with that victim mindset, but it came at the right time. I wish I had it earlier, how to not stay in victim mode, but it actually has to do with the 12-step SAL, so Sex Anonymous Lifeline. So I'm actually very new to SAL. My husband found it first, but there was some, I don't know where it was quoted. I don't know if it was the big book or the small book that the spouses read from, but somewhere in that program was the understanding that victim role is the very first addiction to any addiction or any codependent. That victim mentality is in itself the core of any addiction. For my spouse, he was looking to stay victimized, to stay resentful, right? So that his addiction was seeking how to relieve that resentment via coping with pornography and masturbation or food. And so, but for me, I never thought it connected, but that resentment, aka for me being in the victim role, and there is understanding that victim role does have a place in a victimized spouse. I am not discarding that. Yes, I am a victim, but living in a toxic understanding of victim mentality was something that I needed to change. So to hear that resentment and victim is the first addiction, that changed my mind. That changed my life. Because I realized, looking back, hindsight, of course, it's always 2020, that I relished at times in my own victim mentality. And I was living in that resentment because I thought that in some subconscious way would change my husband. If he just knew how much I resented him, if he just knew how much I was victimized by this, if he just knew what I've lost, both in self-worth, sexuality, motherhood, and spousal duties, then he would understand that it's time to change. But that never fixed him. That only made him cope more. So for me, the last 2 years after getting my house in order prompting, I realized, of course, only 6 months ago, that living in toxic resentment isn't what heals. And so to look inward, again, that house in order, I went inward this time and I tried to understand what I needed to keep in order inward. And I realized very quickly that I had to keep my resentment and my victim mentality in check. I had to understand that, yes, when that victimhood needed to be processed and felt, I allowed that space. But if it became a point of, I'm holding on to this because I want to change you, I want to prove to you that you are in the wrong, then I had to understand, no, let's surrender that to the higher power. Let's do some sponsoring. Let's go talk to my sponsor. I'm also a sponsee, I'm a sponsee and a sponsor for a different 12-step, not SAL yet. But I learned from my sponsee when she's having a hard time. And I'm like, I understand where you're at. That's the inner turmoil I'm going through. Here's what I've learned. Let's surrender it. And let's process it in the most appropriate way where it needs to be. So it is a balancing act. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Melissa. And I love that you are giving back and trying to share what you have learned about this with others. Because, I mean, if I'm not working my 12th step and giving back, well, I've worked an 11-step program. And my sponsor told me, well, good luck staying sober in an 11-step program. So anyways, Next question comes in from an anonymous attendee here. This person says, hey, I'm a recovering sexaholic. My wife discovered the extent of my lying after I was sober and in my 12-step program. I value that we avoid physical intimacy. It heals me and her with good boundaries. Do you stay dry? And how does it help? I ask because I want to heal this, but I don't deserve it.
So stay dry. Maybe clarify for that one.
Yeah, so drying out period. So in just abstinent from sex with the spouse.
Ah, yes. Okay, that's where I was going, but I wanted to make sure. So with me and my spouse, we do have boundaries around our intimate life. They are interchangeable, but um there is a non-dried out period. We love our intimacy now, but there are times where if I'm not feeling safe or if I'm feeling triggered, I am in charge of that boundary of I don't feel like doing this. I'm not comfortable with it tonight. So I hope that answers the question. But yes, there are boundaries, but no, we do not. There have been times toxically I did withhold sex from my sex addict thinking that that would help. Again, codependent, betrayal trauma speaking. But now in my healing journey, I understand. My husband's only been completely sober for 6 months, and that's not white knuckling sober. This is the first time in 15 years that he has done it full on sober. But even during the white knuckling sober times, I did have my boundaries of not today. I don't feel comfortable. And he had to understand and respect that boundary. There were definite times where he did not want to respect that. But we also knew that was his addict talking. So yes, I hope that answers I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Melissa. And each situation is personal to that person. And just like, you shared so many things that I think many women, many spouses who are in a similar situation, whether it was their wife that was doing that or their husband doing that, would have said, that's it, divorce, and I'm out. But you have made choices to not do that. And it seems to be bearing fruit. And that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that these are individual decisions and those are where you're at. Melissa, you've come back several times talking about your relationship with your higher power, sitting down and talking with, conversing with your higher power. How has your relationship with your higher power evolved and developed over the years of going through this ordeal?
Oh man, buckle up. So it was a train wreck, actually. A little bit of my personal history. I was actually sexually molested as a little girl. And that really messed with my higher power understanding. I thought that I was not good enough to keep me from that trauma, from that experience in my life. I was only 6, all the way up to 10 when my abuse was happening from multiple abusers. And so going to church, I always was told that, God loves his children. And I just remember thinking multiple times, he loves his children, but me. And so it was a mess. It was a mess for many, many years. And with my husband's sex addiction and then transitioning food addiction, I just was always under the impression that I had done something wrong. I obviously deserve this. And God, higher power, does not care about me, Melissa M. But the train wreck did need to die. The train wreck needed to stop having train wrecks in my life. And my higher power knew that. And my transition of understanding that there is a loving God that truly wants to heal us and doesn't hate us and only allows trials to create more fruit in this life of healing others, came at a time when I was a carpenter. I've mentioned that I'm a carpenter. My saw malfunctioned one night and 2 of my fingers were severed on my left hand. Now, how does this bring me back to my higher power? I didn't know at the time. I thought, here we go again. Like, I don't have favor in God, because otherwise he wouldn't be cutting my fingers off, So the very watered down version of that story. It's actually on another podcast, the whole story, but watered down version is there were angels that were administered to me that night. I was in a locked garage. I was alone. It was a detached garage. Nobody knew I was in the garage. My husband thought I was elsewhere. And I had severed 2 arteries. And I was dying. And I had nowhere else to turn but to my higher power. Again, desperation over faith. Sometimes it really is what changes lives. I wish it was more faith than desperation, but all the same, here we are. And I reached out to my higher power and I said, help. And he sent 2 angels that I couldn't see, but I could hear. One was giving me instructions on how to get a tourniquet and stop the blood. And the other, a woman, was singing a song to me. And I was told to sing along so that I wasn't passing out and dying. Anyway, and then after getting into the hospital, again, watered down version, I was told that my fingers were not savable. And I felt a higher power tell me to ask again. And I asked every single individual, save my finger, please, until someone finally agreed because I pestered enough. And I woke up and my fingers were spared. However, I had a 99.9% chance that one of the fingers would be rejected because it was at that point a foreign object. And I felt my higher power say, turn to me one more time. And I turned to him and I said, please spare my finger, but if not, let it be thy will. And in my religion, we have what's called priesthood blessings, where we get prayers put over our heads directly from our higher power. And within that prayer that I was given, that blessing, I was told, Melissa, God is very aware of your circumstance. Melissa, your finger will not leave your hand, so say I, God. A year after my accident, I, for the very first time, played that song that was given to me in the garage, which happened to be Abide With Me 'Tis Eventide, on my violin, with the hand, which happened to be my left hand, that had lost both of those fingers, which is a vital violin playing hand. For those of you that don't know violin, the left hand is crucial and you cannot lose 2 fingers. But a year to the day, I played violin, not flawlessly, but I played with all 5 fingers intact on my left hand. And I will never, ever turn from my higher power, because that taught me that he's in charge, it's his will, and he is there to love and guide us. And then through my husband's betrayal, he's been there the whole time. It was me that had to get educated on his goodness. It was me that needed to understand him. And I have been seeking ever since. I love scripture. I love 12 steps. I love everything to do with God and Christ. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Melissa. And if you wouldn't mind sending me a link to that other podcast that you referenced there, I'll put it in the show notes of the podcast so that anybody who wants to hear that story in more depth can do so. Man, sounds like some amazing stuff. And I really appreciate you referencing that and going into it here. I'd like to jump a little bit into a little bit more of a different question that I've got here. You know, you talked about, you talked about how you needed to recognize your own self-worth and that in order to move forward. How did you change from where maybe, well, you also said, hey, God loves all his children but me. How did you change from that into having self-worth without it being, you know, arrogance or cockiness?
Yeah. I love that question. I have many, many stories. My husband always laughs, you need to write a book. But for the time being, I do podcasts. So how did I find my self-worth without being arrogant? It unfortunately comes with a devastating story, but one with a happy ending. At the time that I needed to find my self-worth, and not in comparison to what my husband was looking at and otherwise. I was pregnant with my daughter. This is before the blood disorder was diagnosed and before we almost lost her. And I had a very influential friend that had just posted on Facebook that she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And this influential friend, she really did remind me that there is goodness in this world. And she, being the one that carried a lot of that goodness, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I watched her journey for a year fighting that cancer. And one of the last things she said before she passed away, she got asked all the time, what's the one thing you regret in this life that if you could do it over again, you would? This dear friend of mine was a mother of 3 girls. 2 were identical twins, and then a darling older daughter. And what she said shook me to the core. And it was around the same time where suicide prevention line was being called, and kind of everything was coming to crashing down. And her regret in this life, this beautiful, influential, God-fearing woman, her regret was she didn't love herself. And she chased the worldly skinniness and beauty and anything that she could find her worth in a worldly aspect of looks, of physical looks. And her regret was her daughters would have a mom that only cared about what she looked like and not finding her true worth in her soul. And I remember dropping everything I did as I read that post, pregnant with my own daughter, my only daughter, and knowing that if I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in this moment, I would have the exact same regret, that I didn't spend my life finding my true worth and not chasing the physical, just flitty vanity worth that this world says our worth as women is tied up in. And I sobbed. I sobbed and I sobbed and I said, that is what my worth is tied in right now. And even that doesn't get the attention of my husband. And I am wasting my time. I don't know where my worth stands. I don't know where to find my worth other than in physical appearance. And even that clearly doesn't do any good for me. And I just bawled. Because if I were diagnosed, I would have the exact same thing. And so from that point on, I moved forward in finding my true worth that had nothing to do with the physical appearance of body. It had everything to do with that inward worth. Where does my worth lie? What am I good for? Who am I? What is my purpose? And where is my higher power? And that higher power stepped in and he said, finally, I am so excited to show you where your worth is. And yes, you are a darling, beautiful woman on this earth, but that is not where your worth needs to be tied up in. Your worth is where I need it to be. And that, for me, I'm still finding it, but that worth is being a Christ-like person who helps others, who supports my addict spouse where I can. I'm not perfect in that. I still get triggered. I still get trauma, but I love him and I love myself. And I want to be a good mom. And I find my worth in being a good mom, showing up as a Christ-like person, helping where I can, but knowing full well that my worth is tied up in Jesus Christ, my higher power, and his light is my worth. It has nothing to do with vanity, nothing. And it's wonderful. It has untied me from that rat race of being just so, all for the attention of my addict spouse, who in the end wasn't going to give it to me anyway. He was addicted. It wasn't even his choice. I was chasing a ghost. And once I started turning and finding my worth in Christ, I started seeing just how valuable life actually is. And it is a beautiful life. And to turn around and help others really fills my bucket.
Mm. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was beautiful. I appreciate your relating of that experience and faith there. We've got a couple more questions from our live audience that we'll get to before we close up here. First one is from an anonymous attendee. Person says, what words of advice would you have to a betraying spouse, one who is betraying?
To betraying, yes. So there is a lot of grace that you have to give yourself that I did not give my own spouse. And it is one of my biggest regrets in this life that I wouldn't allow him grace. I still struggle with it. But one of the biggest things as a betraying spouse that you can do yourself is know that your worth is not tied up in the actions that you do, both good and bad. Your worth is the grace you give yourself. And that grace is understanding that you are doing what you can to heal yourself and to love yourself. And turning to your higher power. I have seen time and time again with my spouse where he wasn't turning to his higher power and he was turning to his addiction and the hot and cold of that. But the moments that he would turn to his higher power are the most incredible moments of my life. He is a new creature in Christ when he turns to his higher power. He is delightful to be around, even if he's still struggling with his own triggers. He is a beautiful soul because he has found grace and he extends grace to himself. So your worth is not in your actions. Your worth is already intact. You get to go find it. I really am excited for you to go find it.
Love that. Thank you. And I think that might also dovetail into this next question that comes from Zach from our live audience. Zach says, hi, Melissa. Thank you for your share. I'm also a recovering addict and I struggle with perfectionism and intense self-criticism. How have you seen God's hand in helping you overcome these things? And do you have any suggestions?
Oh, yes. So I have seen it in my own life with perfectionism and extreme self-annihilation. I've also seen it in my spouse, my addict, more so in my addict because he hates failure. He won't try because there's failure connected to trying. And that kept him stuck in his addiction for many years because there was no hope. Well, I'm going to fail anyway. Might as well just stay in it. But for me, that self-annihilation of you're not doing it perfectly, so you need to just quit or, keep tearing myself apart. My words of advice is truly go inward and see what brings you joy in this life. There is something I didn't touch base with, but something that my higher power has taught me is there are passions and talents that we are given in this life, and it's not just for fun. There are passions like woodworking that I was given, and yes, it has some interesting disjointing moments, if you will, but I had found joy in the passion of woodworking, both for my own good of building beautiful things for my house, but also giving, right? So turning around and helping others. But there is a sense of purpose to find the gifts that our higher power have endowed us in this life. And there are spiritual ones, there are physical ones, there are mental ones. And my biggest thing that I would tell you right now is to seek after those talents, those joys, and really let them come to life. My husband struggles with finding his own joys, like I said, because he doesn't want to fail. But recently, he loves singing. He's always been such a good singer, but he's put it on the back burner because he feels like he's failing. But recently, within the last week, he's always loved cello. He's always loved the sound of the cello. I myself am a violin player, and I've loved the cello. And just this week, he turned to me and he said, what if I start learning cello? What if? And I have never heard this man say what if to a new talent or hobby in my life. And I just remember thinking, yes, what if? What if you found that joy? Because music to the soul is a huge power in my life. It's a huge power in his life. And a new talent to find not worth in that talent, but to find that he's good at something. And he's not just sitting in the slosh of his choices. He's proactively finding good in his life. And if that is cello lessons, done deal. So, what brings you joy? What passion have you been wanting to try or put on the back burner? Go after it. See what it does and see what your higher power does with it, both in your life and in others.
I love that. Great words of wisdom to close us out with, Melissa. Thank you so much. And one phrase that comes to mind with me as we get ready to close out our meeting here is reading from the Big Book. This is page 64. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And I think that's something that you are portraying here. I mean, as the spiritual malady is overcome, you're cleaning your house, you're taking care of things, whatever, these things are happening, and it's happening not just in your own life, but in the lives of those that are connected to you. And I see that happening in so many people's lives who are straightening out spiritually through the steps of recovery and applying these principles. Thank you so much, Melissa, for a fantastic RICO 12 speaker meeting. If we missed your question there in the live audience, or if you have more questions, please consider joining our WhatsApp community. Send me an email at rico12pod@gmail.com. to join in the conversation. If you're feeling inspired, share your insights in a 3 to 4 minute 12-step style recording on the RICO 12 Shares Speak Pipe link that I'll have in the chat and the show notes of the meeting. And if you haven't already done this, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's a great and powerful way to work our step 12. Make sure to check out the Afro-Euro RICO 12 recordings, our Noodle It Out with Nikki, our Big Book Roundtable recordings that we've all got every week. Stay up with all those things. Next week on Friday, Dennis T., who has been a previous guest speaker on meetings number 16 and 75, will share insights on using the 4 absolutes in practicing step 10. And it's going to be really cool. I've heard him talk on this before, and I'm excited to hear this. Stay tuned for our weekly releases and exciting new resources coming next year. Now let's launch off into the rest of our day with the 3rd step prayer that Melissa will say for us.
Okay. God, I offer myself to you to build with me and to do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do your will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of your power, your love, and your way of life. May I do your will always.
Amen. Everybody, remember there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together. Work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching